The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. This is Elisa Baum. I'm GridGain Systems Senior Director of Product Marketing. We'll begin in just a moment, but first I'd like to conduct a bit of housekeeping. First, please raise your hand using the hand icon located in the GoToWebinar control panel to let me know if you can hear me. Let's see here. Okay, great. Next, during this webinar, you will be on mute, but should you have any questions during the discussion, please enter them in the questions field within the control panel. At the end of the webinar, we will take time to answer as many questions as possible. And in addition, a recording of this webinar and the slides will be made available to everyone within 48 hours. I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar, Gone in Memory in 60 Minutes, or rather GridGain Cloud in Memory Computing Deployed in Minutes. It's being presented today by GridGain Systems Technical Evangelist Akmal Chaudhry, and we'll be starting off with Rob Meyer, who is GridGain Systems Senior Director of Outbound Product Management. And with that said, I'll turn the floor over to Rob.
Okay, well, good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. I'm Rob Meyer. You can recognize me by my American accent. With me is Akmal Chaudhry. Akmal, you will recognize by his British accent a clear advantage in speaking. We're going to be taking you through what may be the shortest webinar we do in a long time because it is about GridGain Cloud. And of course, when it's cloud, it's simple, right? So we should be able to do everything in minutes. And that is what Akmal is going to try to do. So, for those of you who don't know what GridGain Cloud is, it is basically something we announced in June that it entered beta. And I'm not sure if any of you have tried it out yet. It'll be interesting to hear during the webinar what your experiences have been. But for those of you who haven't, you can just go to cloud.gridgain.com, just appeared on the top of the screen, and go try it out. But let me explain very quickly how it works. And Akmal is going to go through it in a little bit more detail. So basically, this is an in-memory SQL cache as a service that you can deploy, get up and running, populate in minutes. Now, what's a SQL cache, you say? It's basically an in-memory cache you can access completely via SQL, or if you want, you can also use key value APIs. It's only in memory. If you want to increase its reliability, you add more nodes to the cluster and you create more copies of the data so that if one node goes down, everything's still up and running. You can do this completely using ANSI-99 SQL EDL to define the schema and DML to go insert, query, and update. And it is completely a cloud service. What you see is what you get literally. You work everything out of the web console for configuring and monitoring, and you can access it via SQL driver or REST or via a connection as a thin client. So it literally takes 3 clicks to start a cluster, as Akmal will prove. And then once you're in there, you have a console that you can use to control, to monitor the cluster, and also to go test it out. So you have the ability to go type out and save your own favorite queries and interactively test out what you've got. You can also load interactively if you want. And then you're going to connect either via JDBC or ODBC or REST or even Apache Ignite or GridGain Thin Client, just like you're used to with GridGain. Now, that said, as you will soon see, GridGain in the cloud is not the same as GridGain Cloud. These are different use cases. What I mean by that is if you're used to Apache Ignite or you're used to GridGain, you know that you can use it as an in-memory data grid, as on top of existing databases like a relational database or Mongo or Cassandra. You can use it as a full-blown in-memory database with hybrid memory from RAM all the way down to spinning disks. You can use it for streaming analytics, and you can use it for continuous learning. So there are a whole range of use cases where it's really either sitting in between the applications and databases, or it's storing things and doing compute. In the case of GridGain Cloud, GridGain Cloud is more of a cache-aside pattern where the application is talking both to GridGain Cloud and to the underlying database. And while it may be as simple as just adding a couple extra SQL commands or changing them to point to GridGain Cloud to get all their data, it is still cache-aside. So that's what we mean right now by them being different. So with that, I wanted to go through that quickly to set the context and then hand it over to Akmal, who's basically going to show us what would have been a mission impossible now being a mission possible, which is deploying an Ignite or GridGain cluster and getting it up and running in minutes. So with that, let me go and hand over control to you, Akmal. And you should be seeing it now.
Great. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Alicia. I assume you can see my desktop there at the moment?
Yes, it's already dark in the
Not
UK.
much. Yes, a few folders and files on the desktop there. And again, I'd echo my welcome statement, as Rob mentioned. So thank you for joining us today. And as Rob was saying, so this is a kind of an interesting development as far as Apache Ignite and GridGain are concerned. So cloud-based environments are quite popular these days, and it's another option, another strategy that people have in terms of where they now can run their applications, and there are certain advantages to this as well. And of course, GridGain gives you some of these benefits too, which we'll discuss very shortly. So as Rob was saying, cloud.gridgain.com, use the secure HTTP connection will get you to the landing page as we have visible here. And it's a very simple process. So there is a sign up button on the bottom left-hand side, just asks for some information, set a password, email address, and then you get verification from that. And then once that's done, you can sign in and connect. And that's exactly what I'll do. So I've previously signed up for this already. And as you can see, very straightforward, just my email address and password, and that should get me in. And there we go. And so if you are familiar with the web console, which is available, this will look a little bit familiar. So along the top, we've certainly got a few options here, such as queries, monitoring. There's documentation link here as well. So this is based on very similar technology. And at the moment, as you can see, nothing running. So no clusters. And what we're going to do then is I'll walk you through and we'll launch a cluster and I'll show you some of the options. And then we have a couple of short demos to demonstrate, a couple of ways that we can run some code and just test out the environment. So let's go ahead and do that then. So launch cluster. Okay, now with this box here, we can choose the name and we can select the region here because this is based on Amazon Web Services. So we'll stick to what we have available. And in terms of the memory size, as you can see, there's a number of options that are available as well. 1 gigabyte, T2 micro, 15.2 gigabytes. That's an R4 large, and then right at the top end, 61 gigabytes. Now, there is a free option that's provided, which is this 1 gigabyte T2 micro with 1 node. Okay, you pay nothing for this. That doesn't. I mean, it's I guess useful for sort of learning purposes, but if you want to do something a little bit more substantial and have a slightly bigger cluster, then it's worthwhile to have an environment where you've actually got a few more nodes, and we'll do exactly that. Okay, so I will set this now to 4, and as you can see, I mean, this cost here is sort of 64 cents for 1 hour of compute time, which is very competitive. And again, if I go back to this and then try something else, for example, you can see here a little bit more costly. And again, for the sort of top end, again, $20, $20.50 per hour. That's a little bit at the high end there, but we'll stick with this. I think this should be sufficient for our needs for today. So I'll keep the name, my cluster, that's fine. And with this kind of paid option, it will ask you for your credit card information for the first time that you use it. Now, I've already entered in those details, and the system remembers those details. So now I don't have to put them in again. I can simply say launch, and it will provision and have that cluster up and running for me very shortly. So let me do that now. And this 4-node option is fine. Okay. Now, this will take a few moments to launch. And whilst it does that, I don't need Chrome to remember this. As you can see, we're getting a kind of a starting message appearing in the middle here. It takes a moment or two just to provision that and get running. In the meantime, let me just go down here and let's focus on a little bit of SQL code, which we'll be looking at momentarily. So whilst that's launching, let me try and zoom in a bit here and make this a little bit larger so you can see it. So the data set that comes as part of this, and which both demos will use, consists of a number of SQL tables, country, city, language. We'll look at those momentarily. And these are quite substantial in terms, they're not very, very simple tables, although majority of them do use simple types such as character, decimal, and integer types, for example. So here we have an example. Let me just highlight this. Okay, so this is the country table. Now, as you can see, this is all standard SQL. Ignite supports SQL 99, and by extension, naturally, so does GridGain, and so does GridGain Cloud. There is a little bit of an extension in terms of the DDL syntax right at the bottom here, if we look with. Okay, so this is providing some hints to the cluster environment. So here we are specifying that the data are partitioned, but we have no backups. Okay, so backups equals 1 is the default. Essentially, that says just one copy. So if we wanted to have additional copies of this, perhaps for redundancy reasons, or fault tolerance, or some other reason that we want to ensure that the data are available, so if some part of our cluster goes down, we can specify and change that there. The cache name, in this case, we're also setting it to the same name that we have for the actual create table statement. So in this case, we're choosing country. And if we scroll down a little bit further here, we can see now we've done something similar here for city. Okay, so this is slightly smaller in terms of the number of fields that we have, but again, very similar information. So we've specified again that it's partitioned. There's only one backup. And we can add some additional information here. So notice that we've got this notion of affinity key, okay? So one of the things that Ignite, and naturally GridGain by extension, can do is this ability to kind of co-locate data, which is very, very useful. So in distributed environments, we want to avoid moving data around too much, and where it makes sense that data resides together, because there perhaps is some relationship between that data, we can say that this data should be co-located together. And again, here we've got cache name is equal to city. That's fine. And all of the rest of it looks great. We can create indexes as well. So here's an example of a create index on this particular city table on the country code. And then we've got one more table here as well, which is country language. And then again, we have a create index statement just below that as well. So we can do this. And then just below, we've now got statements to actually start populating these tables. And this is actually quite long. So if I just scroll down a little bit, so this is all for the city table. And let me just scroll down, scroll down, scroll down. We should see additional data popping up any moment now, which will allow us to have a look at this, which is, oops, let me just go there. This is the country table, again, values that we're going to insert into that. And if we scroll down even further, right towards the end, here we go. Here is that country language table as well. So these are all values that we're going to insert into the couple of tables that we're going to create using two different methods. Okay, let me just shrink this down now, make this smaller. Excuse me. I can close this now. Okay, we'll have a look at this very shortly. So let me scroll back here, and there we go. So our cluster is now running. It's in the running state, and it's been going for a couple of minutes there. So there we go. We've got T2 micro 4 nodes in this cluster, and again, we can have a look at this. For example, if we go to the monitoring and look at the dashboard, for example, it gives us a little bit of information into what's actually going on. So heap sizes, CPU. Now, obviously, at the moment, we're not doing anything. We're not loading, we're not running any jobs, so the statistics don't actually show anything in particular. Once we start to utilize this cluster, then obviously it makes sense to come back here and look at how things are actually working. Notice also that right at the bottom here, caches, there is a default cache, but nothing else right now. So that will change momentarily when we actually do a bit of table creation. So let's switch back to clusters. And as part of this environment, really to get people up and running very quickly, there's a couple of demos that they built in, which are very useful just to show you how things actually work. So the very first one is what's labeled as a quick demo. And one of the tasks that we can do is directly from the web-based environment, we can ask to populate. So exactly those tables that I was showing you a few moments ago, it will run those SQL commands, it will populate those tables for us, and then we have the ability to run some queries directly from the web environment. So let's do that then. So it says here to preload data, demo data, click here, okay? And I will do that, okay? And it says, are you sure? Yes, let me confirm that. And again, give that a moment or two just to load the sample data for us, okay? Usually this is very fast, and then once this is done, we can actually run some queries from a notebook that will be created for us within this web-based environment. So very handy just to play around, you know, run some sample queries, understand the output, and again, what we can do is look at the monitoring and the dashboard as well to see, you know, sort of utilization, what the caches are, and so on. Okay, there we go. So that's done for us. And let's move across, and it says here query. Now it says here to run sample queries in this, click here and we'll get ourselves a notebook, and we'll do that. Okay, so that launches. There we go. And actually, if we look here, you can see under queries, it's created this World DB notebook for us to give us the opportunity to run some sample queries. And of course, these are SQL queries here, but we can modify them and we can change them as we need. And similarly, if I now just quickly scroll across to the dashboard and have a look here, and just scroll down a little bit, we should find here, in fact, that we've got a little bit more information here. So now we can see that we've got a couple of caches. We've got a city cache, country language, and here we can see that we've got a total primary, the backup, as you can see, and there's really nothing else in terms of utilization. You can scroll up a little bit further here. We can see that it's given us some information in terms of the nodes as well, the 4 nodes that have been created. It gives us the node IP addresses and so on, garbage collection load, CPU load, so on. Okay, that's fine. And if we switch back now to our notebook, from here, as you can see, there's a couple of queries that we can run. So the very first one here, notice here, this is again standard SQL. Okay, so we're going to query using the country table, and we're looking for the maximum population, and give us the, in descending order, limit it to 3. Okay, so again, we can execute this directly from this environment. There we go, and the result comes back fairly quickly. So now data here is a little bit out of date, I think. So you may find, you may question, is this actually accurate? But remember, this is kind of like a snapshot of taking some worldwide population data on cities and countries from a few years ago. But that's fine. I mean, for our purposes, this is just it's going to be okay. So here we can see some information that's being printed out. So China, the most populous country, followed by India and the United States, based upon the data that we actually have available. Okay, scrolling down a little bit further then, we've got something a little bit more substantial here. So in this case, again, we are selecting from the country table, and we're doing a bit more. As you can see, we're doing some grouping and we're doing some ordering, and again, we're limiting by 3 in a descending order. So again, we can execute this, And in this particular case, what we find is that we have, again, if we look at the results, Shanghai in China is the most populous, followed by Moscow, followed by New York in the United States. And this relates back to our query where actually we've specified the 3 countries that we'd like to look at, specifically the United States, Russia, and China, and give us the most populous cities in each of these countries, and then just order them according to the actual population. Okay, great. Scroll down a little bit further then. So select city. So in this case, each city in the cities table has a unique ID. In this case, we're querying on a city with ID 3507. So if we run this, okay, we get back a result, and it just so happens, okay, let me just highlight this, that this happens to be the city of Bukhara in Uzbekistan. And according to this data, the population was 237,100. Now, I was doing a little bit of research earlier on just to find out about this city. So on Wikipedia, it has a little bit of information upon this. A very ancient city on the old Silk Road. And just by chance, they had some population numbers here as well. So our numbers are not too far off. Okay, so these numbers on this particular Wikipedia page are from 2016. So that's all well and good. That's great. Okay, so other things we can do. So let's have a look at this query here where we can do an update on the city. So here we are changing the population of this city in Uzbekistan to 1,500. So we're reducing it pretty substantially. So if we execute this now, okay, that's great. Now it comes back and tells us that it's successful here. It gives us a 1, but let's test to see whether it actually has done this update. And so if we go back a little bit and again rerun this query that we ran a few moments ago, just to have a look, and indeed the values have been updated. So now if we look at this, and we can see the population is indeed being changed to 1,500. There we go. And then again, scrolling down to the bottom, delete city. Now we can actually remove this city from our table if we want. And again, if we execute this, right, it just tells us that it's successful. But let's go back and try and run this query that we had a little bit earlier on, just to see whether we can actually get anything back. And if I execute this, notice here that it says result is empty. Okay, couldn't find anything, which means that the data are no longer there. So that's fine. Okay, so this kind of web-based environment is great, and you can create as many queries as you want. You can change them, modify them. You have the option here, for example, to edit, rename, and remove the query if you want. And this is a great way to interact with this particular data set or any other data set. So if you've got some particular data that you want to load and you want to run some queries, just to do kind of initial load perhaps, and then just test the environment, this is a great way to do it. It's quite interactive, as you can see. You get back results visually. You can have a look. Do the data match what I intended, in terms of running the query? And therefore, this is a quick and dirty way of just testing the data set that's been loaded, running some queries just to see and get a feel for what's in there. Okay, great. So let's go back to the clusters. And one of the other examples that we have available is this command line. So let me switch to this. As you can see, the steps involved here a little bit greater than what we had with the quick demo. So the quick demo is exactly that. Quick way just to get in, and it does all the hard work for you. Loads the data, runs the SQL commands, gives you a notebook and an environment to run this. With this command line one, we have to do a little bit more work, okay? So first thing we need to do is to download this GridGain Cloud Client Pack. Now, I did this earlier, so I have this environment over here, and let me just remove these, okay, just to show you, and then we'll come back to this in a moment, that, exactly what you will see is exactly what I'm going to do. So let me just close that. And there we are. So I shall click this. Okay, and obviously this EULA comes up, and please take the time to read this carefully. And if you agree with this and accept the terms and conditions, then please accept. And so this will download a zip file. Okay, there we go. And it's downloaded. Okay, back here. And all I need to do then is just double click this, unpack the zip file. And if we just drill down a little bit further in here, you can see there's a couple of folders here. There's a bin folder, which we're going to use to run some commands from. And again, the EULA is here as well if you want to reread that. There's a README file as well. And we've got the examples located a little bit down here. So this world.sql was the SQL statements that I was showing a little bit earlier in terms of table creation and population. Exactly the same data is in there. Okay, so let's just go back up a bit. Okay, let me minimize this. So that's done. Now, in order to get a secure connection, you need to download a Java key store. Okay, this is generated for you for this environment. And again, very helpfully, it says here, just click here to do that, and I will do that. And the file is downloaded very fast. And the instructions say, take that and put it in the bin folder. And so I will do that. So this is the key store. Okay, and we need to copy this here and then put it in the bin folder. There we are. Okay, so it's there. Oops, did I take that down too far? Yes, I took that down too far. Okay, let me just do undo. Sorry about that. Let me just go back up again. We need to be sure that it's in the bin folder. Let me take this one step at a time rather than trying to do too much. So first copy it there. And once it's there, here in the bin folder, that's where it needs to be. I think I copied it down one folder too far. That's okay. So now it's here. Okay, that's the correct location. There we go. All right, great. Okay, next step. Then how to connect then. So let me click this. And again, so what it says, what we need to do is navigate to the bin folder. And then we need to execute this long command here. And again, very helpfully, we can simply copy this to the clipboard. There we go. And then from this environment here, if I open up a terminal window, there we go. Okay, so now this is just to show you where we are. Print working directory. Okay, so this is in the bin directory. Okay, let me just try and blow that up a little bit for you. And what we have then is just paste that command that I copied. So here you can see this SQL line tool is shipped as part of this. It's a free open source tool, great for running these command line type of, combining this sort of thin client that we have with GridGain. It's a nice kind of shell environment to be able to execute simple commands and do connections for us. Here, again, you can see we're using the thin client. And again, we've got this very long sequence of characters after that, but that's fine. All of this has been generated for us. We don't need to mess around with this. I can hit return. Okay, and then just give that a moment. And we're in. Okay, so it just helpfully tells us that we're connected. So I'm looking at the command prompt there, which is exactly where we need to be. Okay, and let me just move this over to the side for one moment. Minimize this, and again, return to our web environment. Okay, all right. Now, almost final step here is we need to be able to populate the data. So now, from my local Mac, if I run this command, which is shown here, and again, I can simply use this copy to clipboard command. Okay, shift across and paste this here. And again, let me blow this up just so that you can see it as well. Again, what it will do is it will execute this command. I'm connected to my cluster from my Mac, and it will now run these commands for me. So if those tables existed previously, they will be dropped. Okay, you may recall that we had those drop statements in the SQL code. Now it's pretty fast. Okay, so it says here 1.201 seconds to complete all of that. So that's all done. Great. So again, minimize this. Okay, let's just again move this out of the way slightly. And then if we get to the actual query here, you can see that now we've got some SQL that we can run. Again, let me just copy this onto the clipboard. go over across here. And again, I can paste this in my environment here. And again, just blow this up for you. There we go. And we can run this from here. And there we go. So slightly different results there. Okay, so it's not identical to the query that we were running a little bit earlier from the notebook, but here in this particular case, it happens to have printed out Mumbai and Seoul and Sao Paulo as the three cities, because we're doing a select name population from city, order by population, descending, and then just limit it to 3. Okay, there we go. Let's minimize this. Okay, so I think this can go. So other things that will be useful to you. Well, documentation obviously is very helpful, and there's a link directly at the top which will take you to the documentation page. And this will actually give you far more details than we've been able to cover today. There is a Get It Started section, which covers pretty much all we've shown you today, screenshots, but there is a lot more detail here as well, more sort of configuration options that you can utilize. And there are other sections as well in terms of securing the connection, which we were able to do using that key file, for example, and other sort of management and monitoring. And now if we sort of take a look at some of the monitoring capability and switch back to the dashboard, you can see here that because we've utilized it a little bit, there should be a bit more data in here in terms of what's been going on. So if we have a look at the data here, for example, we can see that, okay, CPU load, it's still relatively small. We haven't really stressed this out very much. That's okay. And the rest of it, because we're not really changing, I mean, we deleted sort of one entry earlier on, and that's pretty much it. But if we were doing a lot of updates, deletes, for example, then we might expect to see more changes in these numbers down here, for example. The data are fairly static. We didn't do a lot of work there. Okay, so I think, let me just go back, and then obviously this particular instance, because I'm paying by the hour, then it's a good idea to shut down the cluster when you're finished. Okay, now since it's only about 64 cents an hour or something like that, I think I'm okay for a little while yet, so I'll leave that running for now. But I think that's pretty much all I wanted to show you. So hopefully that's been useful. Okay, so as I said, a couple of inbuilt ways to quickly get started. So either do it directly from the web-based environment as well, which is great, you know, great for sort of initial testing, maybe loading some small data sets just to play around with them, just to check them, run some queries, that's great. And then a command line option as well, which again shows you that you can connect directly to the cluster using the thin client from a shell-based environment as we were using. And by extension, of course, you could do this using other tools, of course. You know, that would be possible too. So if you're using some sort of graphical environment or visualization tool, and you might want to work within that way, then you could do that, because the thin client is generated for you. It shows you what it is. And the documentation contains additional information in terms of authentication and how to ensure that you get a secure connection to the cluster. Okay, great. I think that's back over to you then, Rob. Thank you.
All right, and maybe we'll leave your demo running a little longer just in case some of these questions require you to show some details.
Yes.
One of the questions that came up was you can create multiple copies, and you started going through that. How do you, I think you went through this, but how do you explicitly set the multiple copies or define how you want to break up the data across the cluster? Okay, so
you know, the way that Ignite and GridGain works is that there's certain defaults that are always kind of built in. So in this particular case, if we just switch across here and look at the dashboard, let me just scroll down and we have a look down here. As you can see, the way that this has been set up, we have a total, if we look at these caches, for example, if we look at the very first line, the city cache, we can see that actually the size of the data is a little bit over 8K, of which the primary is 4 and the backup is 4. So when we were creating the tables, we have this option to specify, do we want backups, okay? And in that case, we set backups equals 1. Okay, so that gives us 1 backup. And if we want a bit more sort of redundancy, or we want some, in terms of handling sort of, perhaps we are a little bit paranoid. Maybe we want copies of all our data everywhere. We have the option to increase that number. Now, obviously, in a distributed environment and even something that's cloud-based, there's going to be a little bit of overhead because these nodes need to communicate with each other. That data has to be copied across. So I think it's fairly common to have at least 1 backup. That's a useful way to do it. And typically in a number of distributed environments, that's how we would do it. And again, the default there, as you saw, backup equals 1, sufficient for these needs. So if one of those nodes goes down, I think we would still be okay. We've still got some data backed up elsewhere. And that's, I think, the fairly standard approach to do it. So through the DDL, you can specify it. And in this case, because we're using SQL as the interface, that's fairly easy to do with the small extensions that we have available that GridGain provides.
Okay, and then for the distributed partitioning of the data,
yeah,
you didn't really define affinity keys in this case, but you can do that as well through the SQL to just.
Yes, so I think I kind of briefly mentioned on it. Let me just go back and let me just drill down here. Okay, so this is the file that we had and the examples and the SQL. So this world.sql file, if I just open this again, now because it's .sql, it doesn't have a default application attached to it, but I can just open it in text edit. There we go. And let me just slightly blow this up so we can have a look. Now here for this particular table, which is the country table, we haven't specified anything, no. But if we scroll down a little bit and we look at the city table here, you'll notice that we do have affinity key defined here, which is country code. Okay, so that is giving, oops, sorry. Just this mouse is a little bit sensitive, my apologies. So now we can specify a bit of information here. So as I mentioned, perhaps what we're, a good way to do this is we want to locate cities with countries. That kind of makes sense. So, when we are doing searching across the cluster, perhaps we might be more interested in how many cities there are in a particular country. That means that it's all processed locally. We don't have to run this query across the cluster. Maybe that involves data movement, distributed joins, which are kind of expensive. So even in a cloud-based environment, we need to be aware of these kind of considerations in this architectural thing. Now, obviously, co-location only works kind of one way. It's the law of physics. We can only do it one way. But again, these are choices that we make carefully. So again, through the DDL, we can specify these things. And it enables us through these extensions to have some control and give GridGain some hints as to what it should do and how it should locate the data.
Okay, so if I were using GridGain Cloud as a cache, I could take the DDL out of my existing database.
Yeah.
And I might add a statement like drop table to refresh the cache every time it comes back up. But then I would add the with backups equals 1, add the affinity key for partitioning, but that's the only thing I would add. And then technically the application could start using the same SQL basically to populate GridGain as it was using or access GridGain and populate GridGain the same way it was accessing the database.
Yes, Rob, so you're absolutely right. That's right. So, if we look at the bulk of these statements, let's have a look at the majority of this create table statement. That's standard SQL. There's nothing extraordinary about that. All of that is industry standard. Now, because of the nature of Apache Ignite and GridGain, this is cluster computing. There are things that we need to do in terms of co-locating data. We need to partition the data and so on. So we need to provide some hints. And again, this is where this kind of extension comes along. So your kind of strategy in terms of taking existing code and then adding some this with statement to specify some additional things that the GridGain Cloud environment, for example, would need to do. Yes, that would be the great approach. And you can drop the table as well if it already exists. Obviously, being careful that you do really want to get rid of that data before you upload something else. In our case, because these are just demo tables and demo environment, it's okay. We can reconstruct the data very quickly. In live environments, obviously, need to be a little bit more careful. But yes, your strategies are absolutely spot on here.
Great. Well, those were the questions that I saw. So, Akmal, I wanted to thank you so much for doing this. I did want to show a couple other things before we end. The first thing is we actually have an in-memory computing summit coming up. So there's an early bird discount, and for folks that are watching the webinars. Can you see my screen?
No.
Yes? Okay,
Yes.
Here we go.
Perfect.
So for those of you who are attending the webinar, feel free to, additionally to the 30% discount, use the additional 20% discount with webinar 20 in case you're coming. It's in San Francisco, October 3rd and 2nd. Nice time to be in San Francisco, up near the airport, so pretty close to the airport, so very convenient. In any case, feel free to use that, and hopefully we see you there. We're going to have even more sessions. I know last year we had about 5 keynotes, 40 breakout sessions with practitioners talking about all kinds of topics. It's going to be even bigger this year, so hopefully we see you there. And then if you have any other questions about GridGain Cloud, I think the easiest thing to do is just to go and try it. So go to cloud.gridgain.com, go log in and start using it. A T2 micro, one T2 micro is free, and you can go from there. If you have other things you're looking for, the thing that I always like to do is go to the In-Memory Computing Resource Center and search. But there are various links you'll find in this presentation where you can go to more specific types of assets. So with that, Akmal, I want to thank you once again for going through the demo and showing us how easy it is to do in-memory computing in the cloud.